This is Books for Breakfast, a podcast where we talk about books and writing. I'm Enda Wiley.
And I'm Peter Sir.
And you're all very welcome to this morning's show.
So what's the state of criticism in Ireland? Who needs reviewers and critics? And are they even worth reading in any case? Well, one man who is worth reading is Kevin Power, the novelist, whose The Written World, just published by the Lilliput Press, gathers some of the reviews and essays that he's written over the last decade. I'll be talking to Kevin about his book in this, the last Books for Breakfast of the current season. We hope you've enjoyed the journey so far, and hopefully we'll be back with more in the autumn. In the meantime, feel free to enjoy the now extensive back catalogue of breakfast bites. So delighted to have Kevin Power with us this morning on Books for Breakfast. Kevin established his reputation early with the publication of Bad Day at Black Rock, which showed a fictionalised version of a story that had gripped the country, the death of Brian Murphy in Dublin in 2000 as a result of a violent assault outside a nightclub. And that novel was subsequently made into the award-winning film What Richard Did, directed by Lenny Abramson in 2012. Kevin was the winner of the 2009 Rooney Prize, and last year his much-anticipated second novel, White City, was published and won a lot of attention and praise, and which I read indeed with great interest and pleasure. A darkly funny book, it revisits the same sort of terrain occupied by Bad Day at Black Rock. It's set in the world of Celtic Tiger Ireland among the city's privileged and, in this case, ruthless upper classes, and it's in the voice of the seriously shattered son of a South Dublin banker desperately trying to piece his life together. I think that voice is one of the great achievements of the novel. The long gap between the first and second novels is the subject of the first essay in the book we're discussing today, The Written World, published by Lilliput. And the book is a collection of the essays and reviews that Kevin Power has been writing for the last few years and publishing in the likes of the Dublin Review of Books and the Irish Times and other journals. In the meantime, also, between those novels, Kevin completed a PhD on Norman Mailer and joined the staff of the creative writing department of Trinity College, and established a reputation, I think it's fair to say, as an essayist and reviewer of great style, wit and critical acuity. And this is where I want to start, Kevin. It's just, a book like this is relatively unusual in Ireland. I mean, few writers engage in critical work with the same kind of energy that you've committed to it. And a critical scene is, it seems to me, slightly impoverished. I mean, it's a fair amount of pulled punches and puffery, and writers can often seem wary of committing themselves to a critical opinion lest their own next book might suffer. And I wonder, does that seem a fair reflection of the culture to you? And what, second part of that would be, what drew you into becoming a kind of compulsive reviewer and essayist?
Well, first of all, thanks a million for having me on, Peter. It's lovely to be here. I think that is a fair assessment. Somebody said recently of this book that it is much more common for American writers to practice the critical essay as a kind of matter of course, as a kind of side-handed. They write them left-handed, as the phrase goes, and much less common here in Ireland, where people tend to be rather purely, fiction writers and poets. Although there's always much more crossover. Poets write non-fiction prose much more readily in Ireland than novelists or short story writers. I wonder why that is.
Because no one reads the poetry.
So. Maybe that's it. When I first started out and went back shortly after my first novel came out, Caroline Walsh, who was then editor of the Irish Times and has since passed on and was a brilliant presence in the Irish literary scene and is badly missed. She rang me up and said, "Would you like to review the new Ross Carroll Kelly?" And I said, "Absolutely, yes, I will 100% do that." And it's funny because I was recently speaking to another novelist who had got a similar call more recently from Martin Doyle, who's the current literary editor of the Irish Times. And she had said, "Oh no, absolutely not. I couldn't do that." I was thinking about, we were talking about this, and I thought about, well, why did I say yes? And why did I say yes so enthusiastically? And and it was because the writers I grew up reading and admiring and learning the most from, actually, I think is the key point, were writers who did review and who did write critical essays, cultural analysis, not just book reviews, but, essays, interventions on politics and culture and all that kind of stuff. And it was those essays and reviews that taught me the most about about technique, about, how fiction works, in the title of that James Wood book. And also, it seemed to me that was a necessary part of any kind of thriving literary culture should have this going on in it. It's a minor art form, I'd be the first to say. It's, but it.
I don't know how minor it is. I mean, you think of, some of those American examples. Think of John Updike's critical. I used to love that. Or Gore Vidal or whoever. But there's a whole kind of tradition that's in American. Yeah. I think it's very important art.
Oh, I think so too. There's that Clive James line where he says literary criticism may not be vital to literature, but it is vital to civilization. And I think so much of how we think about ideas in the culture and how we think about art is conducted this way. And it's a service performed, for very little pay by people who do it mostly for love. But I think as a service, it's there because we all depend on it. Not just to find out what books we want to read, but to help us think about the books that we have read, or think about the cultural stuff that's going on that we want to talk about.
Am I right in thinking that there is a certain wariness of writers in, I don't know, maybe your own generation or so, in terms of taking on stuff like this? Because I suppose fiction, and I suppose it is different from poetry in that, fiction has readers and within and without Ireland much more readily than poetry does. And therefore reputation is important, and therefore I suppose how people position themselves, and that maybe there's a certain amount of anxiety about if they're asked to review contemporaries. Or
Ireland is small, this is the problem. But it's also, that's not necessarily a problem either. If we could nurture a literary culture that was a little bit more, hard-headed and durable when it came to critics and writers, giving each other, a bad review makes it sound like it's a gratuitous kind of kicking, but really a considered critique is what I mean, and what I would hope to see. When I first started out, and again, it's that review of that very first review I published in the Irish Times of Russell Carl Kelly. In it, I made a slightly kind of snide remark about Irish literature being stuck in the past and characters walking the fields. And the reference was obviously to Claire Keegan's very, very excellent second collection of short stories. But what I was trying to say was that I wanted to see Irish fiction. This was 2007 or 2008. I wanted to see Irish fiction write about what it meant to be contemporary and urban and or suburban, and people would have phones and they would order lattes and it's hugely changed since then. I no longer need to make that argument. But another writer came up to me after that review came out and said, "Look, we Irish writers don't take shots at each other in print." And I thought, well, why not? Because Claire Keegan, will survive me taking a swipe at her in the Irish Times, and and likewise, if someone else wants to take a swipe at me, I will survive that. I think I have a fairly thick skin about this stuff. But again, you pay a social price in Ireland. If I give someone a mediocre review or a bad review, I'm very likely to run into them or their friends at an event, at a launch, at a festival. And I guess I could pay a social price there. It depends what you value. Do you want everybody to get along, or do you want it to do some thinking about books? And ideally, we could have both. But I'll make the sacrifice if I have to of the social, pleasantness. I'll go with the thinking.
The second question is kind of related to that, because one of the early essays asks the question, what is the state of contemporary book reviewing? And it's a kind of a meta review of Megan Nolan's novel Acts of Desperation, but you use that occasion to interrogate other reviews and by extension the nature of the art of reviewing. And you say there's a perennial worry about the decline of the book review. And I was just wondering, again, why is that the case?
It's become particularly acute in the last 20 years because of the internet, essentially, and because book reviewing or book rating, let's say, has been democratized by Amazon and Goodreads and many other outlets for non-professional readers. God help me, that's what I am, a professional reader, to express their views on books. And some of them are extremely good. I think I make a point in that essay of saying that you can find genuinely good criticism on for example, Goodreads, that you get people who are very smart and very good readers. But you also get people saying things like, The Great Gatsby is the worst book I've ever read. And, these kind of opinions that just have no weight, that are not valuable. But people worry about the decline of the book review because most book reviews are bad, by which I mean they're not really criticism. They're just summaries of the plot and a bit of puffery or a sort of yay or nay. And what I argue for in that piece, and what I hope to do whenever I sit down to write a book review, is to do at least some small bit of thinking about the book under review, and give hopefully the reader of my review something to think with, and something to think about. Now, it doesn't always happen. I've reviewed hundreds of books. Many of those reviews did not succeed in articulating a useful idea, but that's the goal. And I think that's what elevates it beyond, just giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down or repeating the plot.
Well, you make a lot of interesting points actually in that essay. I mean, one of the things that you say is that, it's only actually in literature where the critics tend also to be the practitioners, because obviously in your own case, you're a novelist as well as the critic, but directors, you say, don't review each other's films, or, Billie Eilish doesn't rate albums for Pitchfork. And so is that a problem that the practitioner, there isn't, or should there be, or is it better that the practitioners should review?
Yeah, I mean, there's two possible answers to that. One is that it would be nice to have a kind of separate, clerisy of well-paid book critics who had no vested interest in writing their own fiction. That would be good, because they would be less corruptible, less prone to, log rolling or whatever you want to call it. But the other argument is that the counter argument is that novelists, or anyone who's written fiction or poetry or made a work of art themselves, knows things about that art form that somebody who hasn't doesn't know really in the same way. So that's why when I say the writers I learned the most from were kind of artist critics, like John Updike, whom you mentioned. He was an incredible critic. And many of those, Mary McCarthy or Susan Sontag, they were all kind of artist critics. They both made art and wrote about art. And to me, it seems that that's the ideal perspective for a critic to have. So that's my counter argument against that.
One of the other things you say in that essay as well is you say most books are bad, which is, it kind of sounds like a depressing notion. You say we all know this, but we seldom say it. And it's kind of like there's a dichotomy, because you also say later, you say most art sucks. And the fact is, on the other hand, most art gets pretty good reviews. And you quote Elizabeth Hardwick back in 1959 saying, "Sweet, bland commendations fall everywhere upon the scene. A universal, if somewhat lobotomized accommodation reigns." And I wonder, is that still, that's 1959. That's a long time ago. Is that still the case today? I
mean, I think broadly it is, especially if you look on Twitter. Every book that comes out, pops up on Twitter as the greatest book ever written. This blew me away. This is amazing. This is the greatest memoir I've ever read. No one ever takes a kind of shot at a book on Twitter. And that reluctance to express a negative opinion is very kind of, there's this very peer pressured culture online where well-argued negative opinions are disliked or are seen as kind of somehow scandalous. And it's a very villagey kind of mentality. So if you pop your head above the parapet, as I did recently, to say that Douglas Stewart's books were no good, and I got quite a backlash online for that. But it's not my fault. Douglas Stewart's books aren't good. They just aren't, or so I would argue.
Yeah, you say a few things. You say a few things like that, which I'll come back to actually. But because saying stuff is bad is kind of interesting, in a way, and it's kind of, it brings me back to this point of does art need criticism? Do writers need reviews? And if so, why do they need reviews?
Well, I'll give you a personal example, which was that John Self reviewed my second novel for The Guardian. And I've been thinking about that review ever since. It was a moderately good review. It was nothing, haunting or anything in it. But it made me think about the extent to which I've been too enthralled to kind of a certain way of writing, and it's gonna change the way I write the next one. So that's why writers need reviews, and I'm eternally grateful to John Self for doing that, for giving me a thought that I would not have been able to have myself about my work. Now, obviously, if you get an absolute kicking, if you're the victim of a hatchet job, you're unlikely to learn in that way. But at the same time, I think the duty of the critic is never to the writer. It can't be. The duty of the critic should be to their standards of taste and to the collective standards of taste that they would hope to uphold. in the literary culture in a slightly lonely position because, as I say, most art sucks and yet most bad art is quite popular. I came across, someone asked Henry James about this and said, why is Ben-Hur such a popular book? This was in 1914 or so. And he said, most people have no taste. And this is true. But the good critic is the person with taste. Now, that doesn't mean that they're right, but it does mean that they have good reasons for liking what they like. That's what taste is, basically, I think.
This book, The Written World, it begins with a kind of a much more personal section, I suppose. I mean, the opening essay is the lost decade. And in it, I mean, you describe very interestingly and very honestly what happened to you after the publication of your very successful first novel. I mean, it's kind of like, I don't know, sex and drugs and rock and roll, followed by a bit of an existential crisis when you discover that despite having published a book, you are not, in your own words, a professional writer, but still an apprentice. And you say, this was my peculiar fate, to find myself a writer while I was still unformed, unknown to myself, and lacking utterly in the kind of discipline that a sustained career in writing requires. So how did you deal with that sort of realization and the crisis that followed that?
First badly and then well, I think is the short answer. Yeah, it was what I had to look at what I had wanted out of life and see that it was kind of a delusion, you know. So I really believed, I think, on some fundamental unconscious level, that publishing a novel would solve, you know, the problems of my existence. And I think a lot of young writers do believe this. And they, you know, I teach in Trinity, I teach in the creative writing program. I meet a lot of young writers and I tell them this: publishing, if you publish this book, it will not solve the problems of your existence. And they go, yeah, okay, sure. And I say, all right, you'll figure it, you'll find out for yourself. But I really did believe it. And the worst, in a way, thing that could have happened was that the book was a success. And to a degree, it looked like I had made absolutely the right choice in life at that point. So I sort of, psychologically, I then sat back and said, well, I've done it now. Was, as I talk about in that piece, was figured out how not to make writing a sort of substitute for living, but how to make it a way of thinking and a way of something that ran alongside and intertwined with my life and was, you know, in other words, a job, rather than a sort of all consoling psychological magic bullet, which it definitely is not. It is, you can write something and it will help you process the emotions that you write about. And that's absolutely true. But having done that, you still have to get up the next day and you still have to, you know, work and, you know, figure out ways to live. And yeah, so it really, I went through quite a painful, quite long drawn out process of learning those truths about the world.
And yet you were still writing throughout all of this, weren't you? It wasn't that you stopped writing. I mean, you continued to write and write quite prolifically, but you weren't happy with what you were writing.
No, I wrote 3 bad novels during those years. In a state of kind of panic and desperation, I churned out a draft, and I also wrote 2 plays. I wrote, you know, I was able to do the criticism. I was still reviewing a lot, and I was enjoying that. But the difference between writing fiction and writing criticism is that with criticism, your text is given. You have something to work with. It's much more straightforward. With fiction, you have to kind of trawl into yourself. As with poetry, you have to find the images and the stories and the characters that are meaningful to you. And if you're kind of lying to yourself about who you are or about what kind of person you are, that becomes impossible, essentially. So you're writing in bad faith. You end up writing stuff that just doesn't work. And eventually you have to turn around and look at who you really are and have been before you can start to write more honestly, I think.
And I'm very interested in how you say that you got yourself out of that crisis in a way. You said you had to kind of forget yourself. You say that in trying to be a writer, I've been trying not to be a human being, that bleeding, undefended thing. I had been trying to avoid making what I saw in my stupidity as the various boring or distressing compromises that, properly understood, make up the substance of an actual life.
Yeah, I mean, this is me in my 20s was a guy who sort of walked around going, so I won't need to get a job because I'll publish a book and that will solve my problems. You know, I don't need to save money or get a pension or anything like that because because I'll write books and I'll be very successful. I'll be very rich. It was absolutely a delusion. And those are the things that make up a life, and not just those practical or financial things, but also the emotional things of figuring out how how to relate honestly to another human being, without projecting a full self, without sort of being in a relationship and not understanding why it wasn't working, and blaming the other person when really the fault was probably yours. All of this kind of stuff, which we all have to figure this out. My own version of figuring all this stuff out just happened in the context of having published a successful book at 27 and having been kind of blown off course by that event.
You mentioned Russell Carroll Kelly, and you mentioned being asked to review one of his books, and there's a very interesting essay, kind of a substantial essay about Paul Howard and Russell Carroll Kelly in this book. And I suppose because I've always been interested in the importance of class in your work. I mean, obviously it's very much there in Bad Day in Black Rock, and equally it's there in White City, because you very much cast a satirical eye at a particular sort of privileged private school, South Dublin class, and the kind of people you say you weren't really aware of until you went to college. I keep thinking of that girlfriend who said she just grew up in a normal 6-bedroom house in Fox Rock. It's like your introduction to kind of that world in a way. And I suppose that's a cliche that Ireland, we've told ourselves this cliche for a long time, that Ireland is somehow a classless society, or that class is sort of less important here than it might be, say, in the UK. But obviously, class is also at the centre of the Irish experience, isn't it? I mean, I think it's like it's one of your own creative engines, I think.
It's funny because class is like the great unspoken structuring principle of Irish life. We all know it's there, and we all live our lives according to its dictates, but we only talk about it indirectly or unconsciously. And one of the fascinating things about, first of all, the existence of Russell Carroll Kelly, but second of all, the massive popularity of Russell Carroll Kelly tells us something about how we want to talk about class, which is we want to do it safely in the form of comic popular fiction, which enables us to think through what it means to be. In the piece, I argue that most of Ross's readers are sort of firmly, let's say, call them lower middle class or professional managerial class. They don't come from inherited wealth. They didn't go to a private school necessarily, but they went to university because of free fees, and they have they probably are sort of higher up the social scale than their parents were. And that's kind of my generation. I'm 40 now, and I sort of straddle the Celtic Tiger along with my fellow, I think we're called geriatric millennials. But yeah, and we've essentially moved class, and it's brought us into contact with the really rich people who really run the country. And Ross is one of the ways in which we've kind of we've been helped to think through that experience.
Paul Howard, I'm a huge fan of his work, and I think it seems to get better and edgier all the time. I mean, just there's a recent one where Ross and Cirque are planning to build affordable housing on the Vico Road to annoy the neighbours, and there's a discussion with this architect, so it's ORCHITAC, TACT, who went to Holy Child in Killiney, and whose accent is was say as he said, over the top, that even Ross couldn't understand it, and he has to get Circa to translate it afterwards. But it's it is a kind of like a brilliant creation. But I'm interested in what you say about who the audience for that is. But it seems to be, though, a lot of the audience is also the people who attend. I mean, he's also hugely popular in those private schools and in that kind of milieu, because people love to read about themselves and see themselves mirrored, even if it's totally satire. I mean, I remember he talked about how he kind of first came into it when he was a reporter, and he had to report on kind of Leinster Senior Cup matches, and he got sued, or not, but he got one of the fathers threatened to sue him because he got his son's name wrong. His son scored a try in the Senior Cup, and he got his name wrong, and the father.
Yeah, that's right.
But that line you quote as well, of he goes to see a match in whatever Black Rock, and the boy comes off the field and says to his father, "I don't care what you think about how I fucking play. Just give me just open the fucking wallet and
Open your wallet, yeah."
Your theory about the class system. Up until the mid-90s, Ireland had a well-demarcated class system, small, elite, small lower middle class, big underclass. Then neoliberal policies of global deregulation sparked a boom in foreign direct investment, leading to various social transformations that you've just mentioned there for university education, net immigration, more better jobs. And so that's kind of changed the abundance of money at a certain period has kind of changed the nature of the class system.
That's it. And it changed when you have a huge change in class systems. What you get is a kind of crisis of manners. I talk about this in the piece as well, where nobody's 100% sure how to behave anymore. And one of the most striking things that's happened in Ireland and elsewhere over the last kind of 30 years is the rise of human resources as a kind of as a sort of mismanners. The HR department has taken upon itself, or has been given the role of telling us what's appropriate, what constitutes appropriate behavior in our new neoliberal economy. And there's a good satire to be written about that. I think I don't know if I'm the person to do it, but I think it's definitely true. Because when you have people who are tying themselves up in knots about what constitutes the appropriate thing to say, what you're looking at is a kind of crisis of class mobility. And that's in the Ross books as well. Whenever Ross meets a black person, he always says something like, and this guy is, and I'm not being racist here, but he's basically black. And he doesn't know what the right way to say it is, because the world is changing around him, and it's a crisis of he's the victim of a crisis of manners. And the books are so astute in tracking the way that we express that in language and the way we act. He's kind of in many ways the key Irish writer of that transformation. I think he's a really important writer.
One of the things that's interesting is how our notions of value, literary and cultural worth, are very generation dependent. This is something else that kind of comes across in the book. In what was valued, say, 20 or even 10 years ago is sometimes now completely under the radar or ditched completely. I mean, one of the things you write about, you did your PhD on Norman Mailer. You think, so who reads Norman Mailer now? Or is he just the man who stabbed his wife at a party? But also thinking of Bellow and Roth, even in this context. And Roth is a writer whose star, I suppose it happens, every writer's star dips maybe a bit after their death, but you also have the feeling that people will not be reading, that the culture is sort of inimical to writers like Roth at the moment. So I'm just wondering, I mean, every age, you say, assumes its judgments are final.
Yeah. I mean, don't we? We think we've got it all sorted out now. But this was true 50 years ago, and it was true 100 years ago, and it was true 200 years ago as well. One of the ways in which criticism is valuable is that it can track exactly those kind of generational shifts in taste. Because taste and politics are related. They're not the same thing. We seem to think they're the same thing now. Or for rhetorical purposes, we conflate them all the time. But taste and politics are related, but not the same thing. For example, I'm, broadly speaking, a person of the left, and with many, I hate using a phrase that simple to describe it, but, broadly speaking, I think if I were to catalogue all my political views, you would kind of go, this person is a left liberal person. Anyway, but I admire enormously a writer like Saul Bellow, who was, right wing and became more so as he got older. Mailer, who is a kind of, bizarre hybrid of political views. But, and I think that we lose something. We currently are throwing out lots of babies with lots of bath waters, if that's to coin a very ugly phrase, by throwing away the collected works of writers who happen to hold political opinions that are no longer popular, no longer trendy. And I resist that. I resist that enormously. First of all, I resist using politics as the only possible criterion to judge a writer. I think that's crazy. I mean, that's Philistinism. That's valuing politics above art. And I value art above politics in most instances. So I think it's important to look at those writers and see what's valuable in their work, what we can use to think with, what we can learn from, and what's beautiful. I think that's really important.
No, I think that's true. One of the things that fascinates me about this book as well is that you're not afraid to offer fairly forthright judgments, and just a couple of few examples of those. I mean, this is in every way a terrible book, tone deaf, arch, self-satisfied, unfunny, and utterly misconceived. So that was on Ian McEwan. Or Will Self's new novel is unreadable in two senses. It is difficult to read, and it is almost unbelievably bad. Paul Auster, it's 4321. 4321 is mediocrity turned spinal tapishly up to 11. So you're not afraid to be harsh. I mean, there are a few. I mean, I suppose these are English or American writers. I don't think there's any contemporary, at least, Irish writers who get it in the neck, or at least to that degree. And that's, I suppose, the second part of that question is it too hard to? Can you be critical of an Irish contemporary, or is it, as you say, this country's too small for that, or that you're too close to them, or?
It's funny. I was going to say that because most of those reviews were written a good few years ago, and there's Martin Amis says that writing kind of bad reviews when you're young is a kind of youthful corruption of power, and in a way that's true. But I do stand over those reviews, and I was going to say that I've changed my tune a bit, but I haven't. I just gave Douglas Stewart a real kicking in the Irish Times. I've just reviewed Otessa Moshfegh's new novel, and it's not good. And I said so in the Indo. That hasn't come out yet, because I think it's important to say so. I find it valuable to read reviews like that myself, and I myself have not written them, because it teaches me something about what makes good art good. This is what I'm very interested in, and this is almost a craft thing to be interested in. A really good bad review will identify a craft problem that will help you as a writer think through your own craft. And that's, I think, the final justification for a bad review.
I mean, it's a theme that because you say, for instance, I think one of your heroes is James Wood. And you praise him. He's also a novelist, of course, but you praise him as a great critic in an age that desperately requires great criticism and seldom gets it. So I mean, that is one of the themes, I suppose, that comes across this through this book, is that it is the art of criticism is necessary, and it is not always there. And again, you talk about taste. You say there is no method really except to have superb taste.
Yes, who am I talking about there? But James Wood does have superb taste. You can argue, as people have, that there's a kind of a hidden politics, a hidden somewhat reactionary politics in his taste. But I don't care about that, because every time I read a James Wood essay, I learn something new and valuable about the art of fiction, and that's what criticism to me is for. I also learned something about how to think about the world. Finally, criticism is a way of thinking about art, but that's a way of thinking about everything. I think all writers are looking for the form or the genre that lets them write about everything, or as much as they can. And when they find it, they stick with it. And for me, I hope it's the novel. It may be criticism. I don't. I think it's too early in my career. At least I hope it is, to commit to one or the other. And it may not be for me to say, but I do find criticism a really useful way of writing about the world, about everything.
I'm wondering, related to that, over the years of doing these essays, and some of these are very substantial essays, and some are short kind of reviews where obviously you're written to a kind of very tight deadline. But are there particular discoveries that you'd single out in all of the books that you've reviewed, the things that you've thought about in the time that you've written those, that you'd pick out maybe, or say, I'm really glad I came across that. I'm really glad to have encountered this or that.
I remember I was asked to review one of Emma Donoghue's novels, and I hadn't read any of her previous books. So I said yes, and I started reading through her previous stuff, and I read Room, and I read it in I think 4 or 5 straight hours. I sat up till 5 o'clock in the morning, and it was one of the great reading experiences of my life. And I remember it all the time, because that book is so beautifully done and brilliantly done. It's no great kind of discovery to have discovered Room. This was a few years after everybody else had already read it and realized how good it was. But that stuck with me. There's an American writer called Peter Matthiessen I reviewed years and years ago, who had written a trilogy of novels kind of set in the Deep South in America. The first one's called Killing Mr. Watson, and I thought he was extraordinary. And he's not very well known. So I was very glad to have been sent that to review based on, I had no idea who he was, but once I started reading it, I kind of thought, well, these books are incredible. That was a good one.
Finally, Kevin, just a last question. I suppose it relates to that James Wood piece in the sense that he is a critic, but he's also a novelist. Is it easy to maintain the two strands now going on, or do you find there's a tension between the critic and the novelist?
That's a good question. I find criticism easier to write, which may tell me something about what I should be doing. I don't know. Novels I find quite hard but again, that's a time constraint issue as well. It's very hard to find. If you want to write a novel, you need to give it 2 or 3 hours a day to it, almost every day, or any kind of book length project. I think that's just to keep it alive, to keep it bubbling along. But the essays I can do, they take a week or 2 weeks. The reviews take a day or two. So it's very tempting to kind of say yes to lots of commissions for short pieces, rather than spending time on the novel. And people who write essays or reviews are always saying this. They're always saying, "Oh, I want to spend more time on my novel." But at the same time, if that was what I wanted to be doing, I probably would be doing it. Do you know what I mean? We tend to do what suits us, even if we complain that it's not what we necessarily want to be doing. But I have a novel on the go. As you know, we just moved house, so that has been a huge interruption to all of my work. So hopefully, once we have everything set up here, I'll be able to get into a rhythm and a routine. But I think there is a tension. Yeah, and it arises not just because of my interests, but just because of pure time. To write a novel requires most of your concentration and most of your energy, I have found. Whereas, so if you're divided, then yeah, it can be a bit harder to do them both.
Thanks a lot for coming in today, and Kevin, and talking to us about that.
Thank you.
That was Kevin Power talking about the written world, essays and reviews, and it's published by the Lilliput Press. And details, as always, are on our website, booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com.
I think we've reached the end of our Books for Breakfast podcast this morning. I'm definitely rushing off to have more coffee. And I'm Enda Wiley, and I have Peter Sir here with me. And Peter, would you like to tell everyone about the details of the podcast if they'd like to listen again?
Well, you can subscribe at all the usual sources, Google and Apple and so on. And if you want to check out the notes that go along with this podcast, you can go to booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. And yeah, so
we'll be back again. We'll have the toast on, we'll have the kettle boiling, we will have more books to discuss, and we're looking forward to having you here. So goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.